Hi, friends. Welcome to another edition of the Lovecast. You are listening to episode 116, which is entitled, Do You Speak the Language of the Herd, H-E-R-D, or the Language of the Herd, H-E-A-R-D? Let me repeat that. You're listening to episode 116, which is entitled, Do You Speak the Language of the Herd, spelled H-E-R-D, or do you speak the language of the herd, H-E-A-R-D? Guys, how are you? First, I just want to say thank you to the listeners who reached out to me and shared comments. And just personally, I've heard from a number of folks who listen to this podcast, the Lovecast, on a regular basis, who just... I'll be honest, I was a little nervous to share my last episode with you, which was the previous episode, episode 115, which was about why I decided not to participate in Blackout Tuesday. And that was kind of the social media thing that was designed to be a show of support for Black Lives Matter, and also for the just the protests that were going on in response to George Floyd's tragic death. And, again, if you have not listened to that episode, let me encourage you to listen to that, because I kind of share in pretty significant detail why I chose not to participate in any of those protests, have not participated in any protests, and do not plan to. And again, I know that might sound a little insensitive or whatever, so let me encourage you to, if you haven't listened to that, to please do listen to that episode if you'd like to know my stance. Not because, obviously I'm very sensitive to the plight and the injustices that have been going on. They're not new to me, and there's things I've known about them for quite a long time. But I have made a conscious choice not to participate in any of the kind of the knee-jerk reactions, or any of the reactions I'm seeing, publicly speaking. And so anyway, enough about that. But thank you to the listeners who have decided to reach out and communicate to me that really helped you process some things. And I just know how sensitive our conversations can be these days, because there's a lot of heightened tension. And in my opinion, that's due to an unhelpful American media apparatus that, and again, I share a little bit more about this in our last episode. But yeah, I really feel like our media is a major problem today that's not helping anybody do anything. So I know things are heightened in light of that. I really appreciate the graciousness and attention and carefulness at which you guys listen to my thoughts there. And I'm glad it has served some of you well in this very tumultuous and confusing season we live in. But today what I would like to do is I would actually like to talk a little bit further and about this question of what language we speak. Do we speak the language of the herd, H-E-R-D, and by herd I mean H-E-R-D is like cattle, basically. The status quo, the majority. Do we speak that language, or do we speak the language of the herd, H-E-A-R-D, somebody who is heard, like someone who is listened to? Okay. The reason I asked that question in the title of this podcast is because I think it's an important question. Okay. We have heard, obviously over the last few weeks, if you're listening to this, we are in the midst of a couple of issues in our country. Number one, we're right now, at least, it's the protests. There's been a lot of protests nationwide in lots of major cities, protesting the injustices that our African American brothers and sisters have been suffering at the hands of police officers and some of those injustices. So there's a lot of protests, and there's a group called Black Lives Matter that have been organizing a lot of those protests and all this. And so that's we're in the midst of that. So there's also been significant rioting and vandalism and destruction that's going on. Lots of assaults, lots of people being a lot of violence. There's been a lot of violence going on, and so I know that that doesn't speak for the entire movement. It's not a lot of, not all protesters are violent. I get that. I totally understand that. But there's been a significant amount of violence and looting and all those kinds of things. And so you have probably heard, and this is actually a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who said, basically trying to help people understand the why rioting occurs. And of course, his quote has been, I've seen it floated out there a lot recently, and it's the quote is that riots are the language of the unheard. So riots are the language of the unheard, and I totally agree. They are the language of the heard. Rioting, unheard meaning not H-E-A-R-D, not heard, someone who's not listened to. This is what a riot does, because people who aren't heard, H-E-A-R-D, they're not listened to, they feel desperate. And of course, the anger builds. There's a sense of injustice at not being heard or understood. And so the last resort is, I have nothing else. I'm just full of rage. So I'm just going to kind of explode here. And that's where a lot of this violence. So interesting. And unfortunately, it's very sad that the communities that are the most destroyed because of the violence and the rioting are actually the communities of the very people who are the most vulnerable. So specifically African American communities. I mean, small businesses in African American communities, I mean, they're burned, they're looted. And so it's like burning your own house down to try to make a point. So you may be wanting to make the point, and the point you may be trying to communicate is valid, but then you're homeless because you just burnt your house down. So it's who suffers, it's really sad, but the people who are the most affected by the injustices are also the most affected by the looting and the burning and those kinds of things. So I want to address that, because I've heard people, lots of well-meaning folks out there say, well, the riots are the language of the unheard. Basically, so, and then I've heard a lot of conversation about white America, Caucasian people need to listen to the black community because the African American community does not feel heard. So white people need to listen. Okay. Now, I get it. I understand it. But I want to present to you in this podcast episode a vastly different narrative, okay? Because I'm not really interested in the language of the unheard, H-E-A-R-D, because the language of the unheard, H-E-A-R-D, is predominantly the language of the herd right now, H-E-R-D. So the herd, the masses, seem to be feeling unheard, H-E-A-R-D. Yeah. I definitely know that's true of a lot of our African American brothers. They don't feel heard, H-E-A-R-D. So the majority of folks in that community tend, and this is what we're seeing at least play out in the protests, are saying, hey, we don't feel heard. So the herd, H-E-R-D, feels unheard, H-E-A-R-D. And that not only is this true in the African American community, I feel like there's a lot of pockets in white America, if we want to, I hate the labels, but let's just, for conversation's sake, let's use them. A lot of folks in the white community also would say they don't feel heard, H-E-A-R-D, as well. So that makes them a part of the herd, H-E-R-D. And so what I'm witnessing, especially online and social media, just back and forth, Black Lives Matter, and you hear people saying that on one side, and then the other side is the pushback. All lives matter. And so the all lives matter people don't feel heard, H-E-A-R-D. So there's a herd, H-E-R-D, of folks who don't feel heard on that angle. And then on the other angle, the other political angle, there's folks from the African American community and Black Lives Matter movement, and also folks who would align themselves with that movement, would say they don't feel heard, H-E-A-R-D, as well. So that herd, H-E-R-D, is also feeling H-E-A-R-D, unheard. They're feeling unheard. So that herd, H-E-R-D, is also feeling H-E-A-R-D, unheard. Okay, does that make sense? I know there's a lot of spelling going on here. Bear with me. I'm trying to make a distinction between the two words. Okay, so the herd doesn't feel heard on the African American side, and the herd doesn't feel heard on the Caucasian side of things as well. Okay, if we're going to just be very simplistic about the divisions, and there are folks who align, on both sides of that who may or may not be a part of a minority community. So this is not strictly about race, but these are kind of how the factions are coming across right now. So with that said, I just want to say that I am not interested in the language of the unheard. I'm really more interested in the language of the herd. Yeah, the language of the herd. I mean, we know that the language of the unheard, HEARD, is riot, violence, and even fear, for that matter. We know that. That's the language of the unheard. But I wonder what the language of the herd is. HEARD. Okay, hold that thought. Now, I had this thought a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, when the President of the United States made his statement in front of that church building. Do you remember that? That church building? It was an Episcopal church building right across from the White House that was burned. Yeah, it was burned, which is a pretty significant building to be burned because, first of all, it's right across from the White House. St. John's, I believe, is the name of that church building. It's an Episcopal church building, and it's has a lot of historic relevance. It's sometimes called the Church of the Presidents because it's been frequented by presidents dating all the way back to James Madison. So it's been around a long time, and there was riots and all those kinds of things happening in Washington D.C. and a group of people burned, torched that historic landmark. It's pretty significant, especially if you've been around Washington D.C. and yeah, it's a very significant torching and destruction of that historic piece of property. So in response to like 3 days of violent protests, burning, lots, the president, and of course there was some controversy because the police used tear gas and, they told some protesters to move back from the square. And of course the protesters were not doing that. And then, so they used tear gas to move the protesters forcefully, rubber bullets, I think, and they cleared that area so the president could go out and do a photo op in front of the church building that had been burned. And he held up the Bible and they took pictures of the Bible. And of course that was very controversial picture, as it turns out to be. So later, there was a lot of uproar about that. And of course in my circles, some of the folks that I know that tend to be ex-evangelicals or folks who come from a Christian evangelical background who have been deconstructing some of those belief systems, they tend to react very, very critically of anything that seems, kind of a sense of hypocrisy. So Trump standing in front of the burned out church building, holding up the Bible in a very awkward way. I mean, he was, a lot of the folks I saw on social media were pouncing on him for having a lot of judgmental kind of reactions to him doing that. There was even church officials. I think the archbishop of that community came out and really had a lot of words of condemnation for the president for doing that photo op, and a lot of folks chimed in at how horrible and opportunistic and that was and all that kind of thing. So I want to talk about that because that's a reaction that a lot of people had. Now, on the other side, there were some people, and I was kind of shocked that there weren't more people. There was a few people that were pretty upset that historic sacred site, that sacred church building, was torched. I mean, just because of its history and its prominence and all these things. Like, there were some people who were pretty just like, well, what does that serve? Why did someone light that on fire? And of course, it's the language of the unheard, right? It's the language. It's a riot is a language of the unheard. So I totally get that. There was a lot of emotion pent up there. So, but there were some people who were upset about that. Like, how could someone do that? There's a lot of judgment, a lot of anger towards the folks who would light that church building on fire. So I saw both sides of it. people who are upset at the torching of the church building, people who are upset at the president who was exploiting kind of the Bible and using that as a photo op and, that kind of thing. So I want to just speak to both of those, because to me, both responses are indicative. So if you were upset that there was a church, if you were like upset and kind of judgmental at the folks who torched that historic sacred building, there's something there I want to talk about, okay? And I believe it's the language of the unheard. Unheard, someone who's not listened to. So if you're upset about that church building being torched, I want to talk about the phenomenon of being unheard in that angle. And if you're upset that the president kind of hid behind the Bible and used it as a prop in front of this burned out church building, if you're upset about that, then I also want to point something to you that I think is very important for you to consider. And it goes back to not being heard as well. Heard, heard, listen to. So let me tell you what happens when you don't hear something. Okay. And as I witnessed this, as I watched this church building go up in flames, this sacred building, that's what a church building represents. Okay. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of why that it's symbolic. I don't actually think the building itself is sacred, but it's symbolic. It represents. That's why we have church buildings. It's because, or temples, it's because they're representative of a sacred space. Okay. So when we don't honor sacred spaces, that's a tragedy. Yeah, it's a tragedy. So when you're not heard, when you don't listen, you end up burning down sacred spaces. Can I say that again? When you're not listened to, you end up burning down sacred spaces. So you might be listening to this and you might say, well, that's not me. I mean, I don't do that. I would never torch a church building. Now, I get that, but can I just be honest with you? I've done that. I've torched sacred spaces, haven't you? Let me explain that. I spent years of my life, not intentionally, not consciously, but I grew up in such a way, had my own issues, and I'm not blaming anybody, but for a lot of reasons, I didn't feel heard. Yeah, I didn't feel heard in my own circle. Again, I'm not speaking about my ethnicity or anything like that. Just me as a human being, as a single person growing up, I just didn't feel heard, Heard. I didn't feel understood. And that caused a lot of, I had a lot of trauma, energetic, emotional kind of traumas that happened to me over the years, growing up, going into my young adulthood. And I didn't understand that. And I really, as a child, even somebody growing up, I really wanted someone to see me, which all of us do. I haven't met a human being on the face of the earth that doesn't want to be seen and heard, Heard, heard. I haven't met a person who doesn't want to be seen and heard and even loved and accepted for being just who they are. We all want that. And so for me, I grew up and spent a lot of time in my life not feeling seen or heard or understood. And it didn't take long for me to start burning down my house, my sacred space. Yeah, I'm talking about my body, my being. It didn't take long before I started to torch it. Now, it doesn't make a lot of logical sense because obviously our own sacred space is pretty important. I mean, think about your body, for example. You have to live in your body. So why would someone want to just treat it so badly? But I started doing that. I started abusing, for me personally. I started smoking cigarettes. I think I was 11 years old, 11 or 12. Now on some angle you can say, well, that's what boys being boys. That's what young kids do. But it was more than that for me. I was looking to satiate something I was feeling deep in my core, which I did not understand. I started smoking. Very destructive behavior. I started using drugs and alcohol, abusing alcohol predominantly when I was in, teenage years, 14, 15, 16. I'd started to abuse drugs and alcohol. Yeah. I didn't deal with my traumas that was going on in my life, deep senses of pain that had been there for going back to my young childhood. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't even understand it. I didn't hear it. It was an unheard part of my being that was affected deeply, as we all are, by certain things. So I turned to destructive behaviors because I didn't know, and some of it was pretty outlandish. I mean, some of it got the attention of I got in trouble at school, which is a way to say, hey, I need someone to hear me. So I did destructive things at school so that people would hear me. Again, this is all unconscious. I wasn't aware of that, but I did some pretty destructive behaviors at school. And then eventually, the police started to get involved. I was arrested on a number of occasions as a young adult, as a teenager. Yeah. I was doing some destructive things because I didn't feel heard. Now I can look back on that and understand that. But at the time I didn't. It was just the language of the unheard. HEARD, the language of the unheard. Yeah, I've done that. And what I did, and then even in some way, shape, or form, even throughout my adult life, into my 20s and 30s, I did some of those similar behaviors. Not necessarily drug abuse or, but other things that kind of came out of destructive things that destroyed my home, destroyed my sacred space, my relationships. I did other things that were not healthy because I was not, my depth of my pain, my insides, my being was not heard. HEARD. And if I'm being completely honest, I spent many years hoping, desiring that somebody would hear me, that would see me and hear me. And I was pretty frustrated that I felt misunderstood, not heard. For a long time, I was very frustrated and angry that I always was being misunderstood. My heart seemed to always be misunderstood and not heard. I was waiting for somebody to get me, to hear me, to validate my suffering, my pain. I was waiting, and the more I waited, the angrier I got. Yeah, it's true. The angrier I got, the angrier I became. Yeah, I know all about the language of the unheard. I've spoken it personally in my own life. I'm not really impressed with that language. Doesn't actually, what I've discovered personally speaking is that no matter how much you speak the language of the unheard, HEARD, unheard, you never become heard, HEARD. You never become heard when you speak the language of the unheard. You just become part of the herd, HERD, that doesn't feel heard, HEARD. And we have a majority, a lot of people in this country that don't feel heard, HEARD. They don't feel heard. There's a herd that doesn't feel heard, and they're angry. And we can see it. The protests, the riots, on both sides. Even just a few weeks ago when we had the coronavirus epidemic and the economy was locked down, right? There were a group of people protesting because they didn't feel heard. Their economic turmoil, the fact that they couldn't work and earn money, they weren't being heard. Their businesses were going under. They weren't being heard, or they didn't feel heard. So they were angry. So what did? They protested. Yeah, it's the same thing. There's a lot of people in this country that don't feel heard. I'm not interested in that language because it doesn't accomplish anything. No, I am interested in the language of the herd, HEARD. What is the language of people who hear, who feel heard? I'm interested in that. I wonder we hear a lot about the language of the unheard, but what is the language of the herd? No, not HERD, herd, but HEARD, heard. What is the language of the folks who feel HEARD, heard? I am heard and listened to? What do they speak? What does that look like? Oh, let's talk about that. But give me a moment, because I'm not done talking about the language of the unheard. Okay, so burning your own house down, which is really what a riot is. A riot, looting, it's all about burning your own house down, your own sacred house down. So when we see church buildings being torched, like the one that was torched in Washington, D.C., that is a metaphor of sacred space, of our sacred space being torched because we don't feel heard. Okay? That is a tragedy. On the flip side of it, when we don't deal with this situation of being unheard, when we don't deal with that, there's a tendency to want to be distracted or to hide behind the Bible, which is what we witnessed the president do. He held up the Bible and kind of like wanted to use the Bible as a rallying cry. Again, that's not a commentary of it's being bad or good, but a lot of people were upset about that. But using the Bible as a prop to not actually recognize that the tragedy of a sacred space being torched, like to distract from that tragedy, that there was a sacred space that was torched, using the Bible is as distasteful as it may seem to many of us. Who hasn't done it? Like, it's a metaphor. Again, it's a metaphor. Just like that church building that was torched is a metaphor, so is holding up the Bible as a rallying cry. That's a metaphor as well. Who hasn't done that? Yeah, he who is without sin in this area cast the first stone. You want to throw a rock at the president for using the Bible as a prop? I'm guilty of that. I've done that before. I spent over 20 years doing that. Yeah. I spent over 20 years doing that. Haven't you? Do you really have room to judge the president for doing that? What if he's the mirror of all of us? How long have we been hiding behind religion to not deal with the pain that needs to be heard? Heard. Now, let me tell you a story that I think illustrates this perfectly, okay? There is a theologian by the name of Peter Rollins, okay? Some of you listening to this may have heard of him. Peter Rollins is a fantastic theologian, and he's kind of developed this whole thing called pyrotheology, which I won't get into, but it's amazing. He's also done some writing. He's a great writer, and he has constructed a series of what I would call modern day parables. So modern day parables, and if you know a parable, what is a parable? It's kind of a story, kind of a fictitious story that communicates a deeper point. Okay, so he's written, and Jesus often spoke in parables, as you may know, and we have those stories recorded in the Bible, in the New Testament. But what Peter Rollins has done is he's wrote his own parables to communicate spiritual truths, in today's vernacular. So he tells this one parable that I'd like to repeat here for you on the Lovecast. And one of the stories that he repeats is this parable that basically is about this pastor who has a secret power. Okay, so there is a pastor. He has this secret power that whenever he prays for people, that the person he prays for will become an atheist. And this is not what he wants, obviously. This is not his intention. So he doesn't like the fact that he has this power that causes people to lose their faith when he prays for them. So he's not happy about it. So it's happened so many times for this pastor that he decided that he was not going to pray for people anymore, because it's just so disturbing to him that every time he prays for somebody, they become an atheist. So that's the backdrop in the context of the story. So one particular day, this pastor is riding on a train from one city to the next city. And so while he's on it's like a 3 or 4 hour train ride. So he has his Bible out. He's preparing for his sermon that he's going to give that Sunday. And as he's got his Bible out, he's making notes and doing study. There's a man across the aisle from him on the train that is pretty loud and belligerent. So this man that's across from him, he's got a suit on. He looks like a business guy, but it looks like he's having some kind of business problems. He's on the phone, and as he's talking on the phone, it sounds like he's talking to a business partner, but they're arguing over business. And this guy keeps getting louder and he's cussing. He starts swearing very loudly. And finally, he like slams the phone down. And the guy also has been drinking pretty heavily. So this business guy's got like a bunch of mixed drinks and he's been drinking. So he slams the phone down after he ends this, angry conversation with his business partner, slams back the drink, drinks. Then looks up. His face is red because he's angry and he's been drinking. He looks up and he sees the pastor across from him studying the Bible and trying to concentrate. And he says, "Oh, what are you, religious?" Kind of yells at the pastor. And the pastor looks up and he said, "Yes, sir, I am religious. I'm a pastor. And I'm trying to concentrate and study for my sermon on Sunday." Basically trying to say, "Hey, please don't talk to me." And to the pastor's surprise, the business guy says, "Yeah, I'm pretty religious myself." That got the pastor's attention because that was the last thing he was expecting the business guy to say. And he says, "Oh, really?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "As you can see, I got some problems." He's like, I'm kind of an angry man. I have a bad temper, as you probably heard. And I have a drinking problem. I drink a little bit too much on occasion, as you can probably see. He said, "But I'll tell you what, if it wasn't for that good book right there, if it wasn't for the Bible, I don't know where I'd be. Because I tell you what, I study that thing faithfully. And if it wasn't for church, I really admire your profession, Pastor, because on Wednesdays, every Wednesday, I'm home. I'm there. I was raised that you go to church every Wednesday, and you go to prayer meeting, and on Sunday, you attend the service faithfully, and I'm there every Sunday and every Wednesday. And then, as often as I can, I'm studying the good book. It's the only thing. If you think I'm bad now, if it wasn't for the Bible, it wasn't for church, I don't know where I'd be. It's the only thing that's kept me alive, I think." So the pastor, he's kind of conflicted. In one sense, he kind of likes the fact that this guy has faith, but on the other side of it, he's like, "But the guy really is a mess." So I don't know. I don't know. So he's like, I feel like I need to pray for the guy. So this pastor forgets about his superpower of what happens when he prays for people. And he blurts out, he goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry you're having such a rough time." He said, "Would it be okay if I pray for you?" And the businessman says, "Oh, absolutely. I love prayer and I need all the prayer I can get." So the pastor prays for this man, and about halfway through the prayer, it starts happening. Yeah. The guy starts to have this awakening. And so as soon as the pastor said amen and ended the prayer, the business guy looks up and he has a whole different look. His eyes are wide and he's like, "Pastor." He's like, "What's that?" He said, "I had an epiphany while you were praying for me." He's like, "Really? Tell me about it." He said, "While you were praying for me, it just dawned on me. This stuff's a joke. I've been reading this Bible faithfully for 20 years. I go to church. I've been going to church my whole life. This stuff doesn't work. This doesn't do anything. I'm just as angry as I've ever been. I'm abusing alcohol. I mean, I tell you what, I'm unhappy. I'm as unhappy as I've ever been. This stuff doesn't work. I'm done with this Christianity bullcrap." And the pastor's horrified. He's like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't want this to happen." And he remembers every time I pray, this happens. So they get off the train, they get to their destination, they get off the train and they go their separate ways. And the pastor's really upset about what happened. But the businessman, he gets back to his home and he sits there and he's having some soul searching time. And he says, "Well, since I'm not going to go to church anymore and I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading the Bible anymore, I should probably figure some things out." He's like, "I tell you what, I've been angry for a long time and I don't even know why I'm so angry. I should probably look into that. I should probably get to the roots of that, why I'm so angry. Not only that, I hate my job. I'm not happy with my job. I don't even know why I'm unhappy with my job. It's a great job. I make great money. I do really well. I'm really good at it. But it's so unfulfilling. I'm not satisfied. I wonder what my passions in life really are. Now that I'm not just reading the Bible all the time, going to church, maybe I should figure out what my passions are. Like what I really want to do with my life, as opposed to just trying to follow the rules. I wonder what it is that makes me tick. And I got a drinking problem. And I tell you what, I've been turning to alcohol for so long to try to cope with what I've been feeling. And I should probably find a better coping mechanism. Like, I should probably figure out why I feel like I need to do that. So I'm thinking I'm going to get help with my drinking problem. So this guy ends up figuring out what he wants to do with his life. He ends up figuring out getting to the roots of his anger, and he ends up breaking his addiction to substance abuse and dealing with the traumas that drove him to substance abuse with the alcohol. And he becomes a whole new person. So about 10 years later, the pastor and the businessman run into each other again, but this time the pastor didn't recognize him, but the businessman did. And he said, "Pastor, is that you?" The pastor turns around and says, "Do I know you?" And he said, "Yes, we rode together on the train about 10 years ago, and you prayed for me. Do you remember that?" And the pastor says, "Oh, yes, I certainly do. I certainly remember you now." And he said, "How are you?" And he's like, "Well, I'm doing great. Actually, I'm so glad I ran into you because I wanted to thank you. Because the day you prayed for me, that's when I found my real faith." And I love that. I love that parable, because that's the reality. Like, how many of us have hid behind a form of religion or hid behind the Bible, but never really dealt with the depths of our pain, never really got to the roots to hear our own pain so we can transcend it. You see my point here? That we're all guilty of speaking the language of the unheard. So what have we done because we have not spoken the language of the heard? We've spoken the language of the unheard because we were not heard. So what did we do? We torched our own sacred spaces, or we hid behind a Bible. Yeah, we hid behind religion because we didn't know that we were somebody that was worth knowing and hearing. So therefore we felt unheard. Yeah, can I just say this? That it's more than just the African Americans who have felt unheard. I believe that's the human condition. Now, I'm not speaking about the nuances of what our African American brothers and sisters have endured as a result of the injustices of the slave trade going back 400 years. But I'm not talking about that. That's obviously a unique tragedy that needs to be understood. But I'm talking about big picture here. We are all a mirror of each other. And I'm convinced that there's a whole lot of people that aren't truly hearing their own pain. So we have a lot of people that are speaking the language of the unheard. Again, I'm not interested in that language. I've spoken it. I've torched my own sacred spaces. I've done destructive things to my own home, my own sacred home, my body, my being, my relationships. I've done a lot of destructive things over the years to those folks. And I also have hid behind a Bible. So you won't see me judging or critiquing any group. I understand it. But I'm more interested in what the language of the herd, Heard, is. Because I've been a part of the herd that doesn't feel heard. So I'm interested what is the language of the herd, the truly heard? And here's the thing I want to encourage you. If you're sympathizing today with the plight of the minority communities in our nation that aren't heard, Heard, then my advice to you is to ask this question: in what way is that a mirror of my own pain? Because it's a mirror of your own pain. Maybe you don't feel heard. Maybe you don't feel heard, Heard, in your own life. Here's the thing: it doesn't matter if you're a minority, if you're an African American, or you're not. If you don't feel heard, what is it going to take for you to feel heard? It's a legitimate question. What's it going to take for you to feel heard? Are you waiting for someone to hear you? Are you waiting for an ethnic group to hear you? Waiting for the white America to hear you? It's a legitimate question. Are you waiting for the government to hear you? For the business community to hear you? Who are you waiting for to hear you? Yeah. Can I encourage you with something? And this is true no matter what nationality or race that you belong to. If you feel chronically unheard, what's it going to take for you to feel heard? If you're waiting to feel heard, you're not living. Yeah, I mean that in all sincerity because I've done it. If you're waiting for someone to hear you, you may be waiting a long time because you've just given your power away to whoever you're waiting for to hear you. You're waiting on white America to hear you? Are you waiting on the government to hear you? Who are you waiting on to hear you? Same thing if you're it doesn't matter what your race is. You could be white listening to this. And if you're outraged at the injustice of that there are groups of people who aren't heard today, what are you going to do about it? You might say, well, I'm going to listen. Well, maybe you need to hear as well. Maybe you need to start speaking the language of the herd as well. What does that look like? And I would encourage you, no matter who you are, to stop waiting for other people to hear you. Yeah, it's time to hear our own pain. The people who don't take the time to deeply hear their own pain are going to look for it, and not only that, demand it from other people. And that is the language of unempowerment. That is the language of the unheard. That's the language that causes destruction to sacred spaces. That's the language that causes us to hide behind religious props like the Bible. It's the language of the unheard. Can you hear what I'm saying? It's vitally important that we all start to hear, first and foremost, ourself, our own pain. Because transcending pain doesn't happen outside of you. You don't have to wait for anybody to hear you. You just hear yourself. You get to the root of your own pain, just like that business guy did in that parable story I told. Yeah, he had to deal with it. He had to get to the roots of his own pain. He couldn't hide behind the prop of religion anymore. And you know what? He couldn't wait for someone else to hear him. Because my experience and the experience of those I work with in my own coaching work is this, that when you start to hear your own heart, other people will begin to hear your heart as well. But not until you hear your own heart, have compassion for your own heart, and hold space for your own wounds and traumas in your own heart. When that starts to happen, you start to be heard. Heard. And guess what language the herd speak? Okay, we're going to finally get to that. Guess what language the herd, Heard, those who are listened to first and foremost by themselves, guess what language they speak? Yeah. It's the language of listening, isn't it? Now, I've heard people say, well, if you're white, you need to just shut up and listen. I totally disagree with that context of that. I believe that everybody should listen. White, black, yellow, red, brown. I don't care what nationality, color you have. We all need to be listening, but how do you listen? It's when you feel heard. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody who chronically doesn't feel heard? What do? Yeah, they talk all the time. They're always talking about themselves. They're always promoting themselves, talking about themselves, saying things about themselves. Yeah, constantly. Why do they do that? They don't hear what other people have to say. Rarely do they hear what other people have to say. Why? Because they don't feel heard themselves. So that's why they're not listening. But when you feel heard, the language of the herd, Heard, is a language of listening. You can listen to, first and foremost, your own pain. And when you can hear your own pain and hold space for your own pain, you can hear others. Yeah, it's how it works. Isn't that amazing? You can hear others. So the language of the herd, Heard, is listening. The language of the herd, Heard, is service-oriented. It's about serving others. The language of the herd is the language of being grounded and aware, awake. Yeah. If you feel heard, Heard, you listen, you're service-oriented, you feel grounded and awake, you are profoundly non-judgmental. Let me say that again. You are profoundly non-judgmental. People who feel heard do not resort to judgment of others and accusation of others. All this accusation we're seeing in our society, you hear it on the news, we see it in our Facebook and social media feeds, all this accusation of bigotry and racism. These are all accusations. These are all the language of the unheard. But when you start speaking the language of the herd, Heard, the language of those who feel listened to, they don't operate that way. They're non-judgmental, even when they come across things that they don't agree with. They don't resort to name-calling and accusation and judgment. It's a much higher frequency. They're also non-resistant. Yeah, the language of the unheard is also, it's fear. But the language of the herd is love. It's not fear. It's not retreat. So our media and our society, and I've said this in the last episode, it keeps pulling the two strings, fight and flight, fear and rage, afraid of a virus. Let's hide from a virus. I'm afraid of a virus. That's fear, okay? That's the language of the unheard. Those who speak the language of the unheard, they resort to fear, panic, or rage, okay? And we can tell that we have a whole segment of our population who doesn't feel heard. So they're looking outside of themselves to be heard by somebody else, to be protected by somebody else. Maybe somebody will give us a miracle vaccine or drug that will protect us. Maybe we can hide behind a mask. Maybe we can stay away from any public sphere. Yeah, those are the folks who don't feel heard. They're not listening to their own internal fear. So they're reacting in fear, looking for someone to satiate their fear outside of themselves. Yeah, we have a lot of people doing that. There's a better way. You can actually hold space for the traumas and the fears that have been causing havoc in our being. Yeah, we need to do that, ladies and gentlemen. You know, we need to hold space for ourselves. And not only that, when we hear our own traumas, we don't resort to destructive behaviors that burn our own house down. We don't hide and get distracted from our traumas by hiding behind a Bible or form of religiosity. Yeah, we deal with it. We get to the root of it. That's the language of the herd. Become non-judgmental, non-resistant. So let me just leave. I hope that makes sense. I hope that's clear to you. There's a distinct difference between the language of the unheard and the language of the herd, Heard. Yeah, if you feel heard, you can listen. If you feel heard, you can serve others. If you feel heard, you can become grounded and aware. And if you feel heard, you are profoundly non-judgmental and non-resistant. But if you don't feel heard, you can't listen, you just scream. If you don't feel heard, you can't serve others, you just take what's yours. You hoard. If you don't feel heard, you're not grounded and aware. You're ungrounded and anxious. Completely blind to the tools of fear that the mechanisms in our society are yanking on you with. Fear and rage, that the tools of the media, you're totally unaware of that. You get sucked right into the fear and the rage when you're not grounded. And when you're not heard, you give into judgment and you resist. Let me encourage you to start speaking the language of the heard, not the unheard. Start speaking the language of the heard, H-E-A-R-D, and break free from the language of the heard, H-E-R-D, which is profoundly unheard. Yeah, let's start speaking that language. Let's start holding space and hearing ourselves before we try to hear anybody else. Let's hear our own pain. Let's transcend it there. Thank you, guys. I think I'll leave it there for today. I hope this has been helpful. I've appreciated the comments I've gotten. I'd love to hear from you as the listener. Tell me what you're processing as a result of this conversation. Tell me what you are processing. Okay? Tell me what you are processing. Send me an email to jamal@jamaljavanji.com. You can contact me there. Go to my website, jamaljavanji.com. You can scroll to the bottom and put your email address in there and get on my mailing list, which I would highly recommend. You can also contact me there. I also have a Facebook group called Uprooting from the Poverty Mindset, which it's a free Facebook group. And I present some of the material that I present to my coaching clients. I do present some of that material in that Facebook group. Obviously, it's not quite to the extent that I give to my coaching clients, but it is of service for you. If you'd like to be a part of that Facebook group, it's totally free. Let me encourage you to request it. You can look that up on Facebook and request to join. You'll have to answer, I think, 3 questions, and you can become part of that. And I created that to be a resource to you. And also, if you would just rate and review this podcast on iTunes, if you would do that, that would be super helpful. Anyway, thank you guys for listening. This is quite the times we're living in, and may we all go from being unheard. May we all leave the language of the heard, H-E-R-D, which feels profoundly unheard, and let's start speaking the language of the heard. Yeah, we've had enough of the language of the unheard. Let's start speaking the language of the heard, and we do that by listening to ourselves. Thank you guys. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.